Chapter 1. The best day. James Towns believed in preparation the way some people believed in prayer. Not because he thought preparation could prevent everything from going wrong, but because it reduced the number of surprises that could derail a day. Surprises were overrated. Intention was not. By the time the hospital called about his great-aunt Ruth, James was already halfway through packing a duffel bag he hadn't used since his last academic conference. He paused only long enough to listen, ask the necessary questions, and thank the nurse for calling. When the line went dead, he zipped the bag shut with the calm finality of someone who had already decided. He called his ex-girlfriend next. "Hey," she said, warm and unguarded. "Everything okay?" "Mostly," James replied. "Grams was hurt at work. Nothing life-threatening, but she'll need help for a while. I'm heading up." There was no sigh, no hesitation. "Tell her I'm thinking of her. Drive safe. And don't worry about us. We've got it covered." James smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Thanks." After the call, he sent an email to the university. Family emergency. Short sabbatical. Flexible online schedule. The response came back within the hour. He agreed to their compromise, grateful but unsurprised. People were generally reasonable when you treated them like adults. By sunset, James was on the road. Ruth's town smelled like paper and old trees and something faintly sweet he couldn't place until he opened the door to her shop the next morning. Candles. Rows and rows of them, in every color and scent imaginable. Greeting cards lined the walls in neat, cheerful ranks. James stood in the doorway, hands on his hips, taking inventory. "Well," he said aloud, nodding. "How hard can it be?" The answer, it turned out, was moderately. By the end of the first week, James had learned how to reorder inventory, ring up customers without panicking, and avoid lighting 3 candles at once unless he wanted to set off the smoke alarm. He followed Ruth's handwritten instructions with near religious devotion, adding notes of his own in the margins. Every morning, he brought Ruth her favorite coffee, 2 creams, 1 sugar, and every morning the nurses pretended to scold him while accepting cups of their own. "Don't let them bully you," Ruth said one evening, her voice raspy but amused. "They live for authority." "So do students," James replied. "Different uniforms." She laughed, then winced. He stayed until her eyes drooped and her words began to tangle, then walked home through the soft evening air, grateful for the stretch after standing all day. It was on one of those walks that he saw them. 4 boys, older teenagers, leaning against a wall tagged with graffiti that looked more tired than rebellious. One of them held a knife with the exaggerated casualness of someone who wanted it noticed. James clocked the details automatically. The spacing, the body language, the way their laughter died when they noticed him. "All right," he thought. "Here we are." They stepped into his path. "Where you headed?" the tallest one asked. James stopped walking. Then he laughed. Not a chuckle, not a nervous sound. Full, uncontrolled laughter that bent him at the waist and stole the air from his lungs. He braced his hands on his knees, shoulders shaking, tears pricking his eyes. The boys exchanged glances. "What the hell?" one muttered. James straightened, wiping his eyes. "Sorry," he said sincerely. "That wasn't fair. I shouldn't laugh when people are working." "Working?" the boy with the knife snapped. James tilted his head. "Intimidation. You've got the stance down, but the knife is overkill. Subtlety goes a long way." They stared at him. "And the placement," James continued thoughtfully. "Too predictable. If I were actually scared, I'd already be looking for an exit." "Are you stupid?" someone demanded. James considered that. Statistically unlikely. Silence settled, thick and uncertain. He met each of their eyes in turn, not challenging, just present. "Look, you can rob me. You can hurt me. I won't stop you. But before you decide, I want to make you an offer." The knife wavered. An offer. James glanced at the empty street, then walked past them and sat down against the wall. He patted the space beside him. Might as well be comfortable. After a moment, they sat. Uneasy. Curious. "I teach business," James said, "and I'm helping my aunt run her shop while she heals. I need help. Deliveries. Cleaning. Projects." Laughter broke out, sharp and disbelieving. "You want us to work for you?" "You already are," James replied calmly. "You just don't get paid for it." The tallest boy frowned. "Why aren't you scared?" James smiled. "Because today is the best day of my life." "That doesn't make sense." "Most true things don't at first," James said. He checked his watch and stood. "So, am I getting robbed? Or are you going to make a different choice?" They didn't answer right away, but the knife went back into a pocket. James walked home, heart steady, already planning tomorrow. Because tomorrow, too, would be the best day of his life. Chapter 2. Unlikely employees. The bell over the shop door rang at precisely 9:02 the next morning. James looked up from the register, coffee steaming beside him. Inventory list half annotated with notes like "Ask Ruth about this brand" and "Why does anyone need cinnamon-scented stationery?" His first thought was that he'd misjudged how early retirees woke up. His second thought arrived when 4 teenage boys shuffled inside, hands jammed into pockets, shoulders hunched as if the ceiling might accuse them of something. James smiled. "Well," he said pleasantly, setting down his pen. "You're early." The tallest one, same kid from the night before, scowled. You said morning. I did, James agreed. And it is. The boy glanced at his friends. We thought you were joking. That's fair, James said. I joke a lot. This wasn't one of those times. They stood there, awkward and out of place amid pastel cards and carefully arranged candles. One of them picked up a lavender votive and sniffed it, then recoiled like it had personally insulted him. This place smells weird. That's the eucalyptus, James said. Very popular with people who have their lives together. The boy set it down quickly. James gestured toward the counter. Names first. I'm James. After a beat, the tallest one muttered, Marcus. Good to meet you, Marcus. Devin, another said, eyes darting. Luis. The last boy shrugged. Eli. James nodded, committing them to memory. All right, ground rules. You show up when you say you will. You treat customers with respect. You don't steal. And if something breaks, you tell me. Marcus scoffed. That's it. For today, James replied. We'll ease into disappointment. That earned a reluctant snort from Eli. James handed them aprons Ruth had kept folded beneath the counter. Deliveries first. 2 boxes to Mrs. Kowalski on Elm. 1 to the florist on 3rd. You walk. If you get lost, you ask. People like being asked. Devin frowned. You trust us just like that? James met his gaze. I trust you to make a choice. They didn't look convinced, but they took the boxes. The bell rang again as they left. And again, moments later. This time, the woman who entered didn't hesitate. She was mid-30s, sharp-eyed, with a messenger bag slung across her shoulder and the unmistakable posture of someone used to walking into rooms and being obeyed. Her gaze swept the shop, landed on James, and narrowed. You must be Ruth's nephew. Great-nephew, James corrected. James. Clara Hale, she said briskly. Community liaison. James offered his hand. She shook it, firm and efficient. I saw the boys leave, Clara said. Care to explain why 4 kids with a history of petty crime just walked out of a vulnerable business carrying inventory? James tilted his head. History is such a flexible word. Clara crossed her arms. Naivete isn't a business model. Neither is cynicism, James said mildly. She stared at him. You hired them. Yes. Without references. Correct. Without supervision. They're supervised by the consequences of their choices. Clara exhaled sharply. You won't last a month. James smiled. I teach freshmen. This is familiar territory. Her lips twitched despite herself. You think you're fixing them? No, James said. I'm giving them something to do. That won't save them. It might, he replied. But even if it doesn't, it makes today useful. Clara studied him, something unreadable flickering behind her eyes. Ruth would have liked you. I hope so, James said. I brought coffee. That earned him a huff of laughter she clearly hadn't planned on giving. I'll be watching, Clara warned, backing toward the door. I hope you do, James said. She left. An hour later, the boys returned. On time. Boxes empty. Faces flushed. Mrs. Kowalski gave us cookies, Louise said, stunned. Marcus nodded. She said thank you. James leaned back against the counter, folding his arms. See? Recognition doesn't have to be loud to matter. They stood there, uncertain, but something had shifted. Outside, Clara paused across the street, watching through the window. And for the first time in a long while, she wondered if maybe, just maybe, she'd been wrong. Chapter 3, Candle Wax and Consequences. By the 4th day, the shop had developed a rhythm. James unlocked the door at 8:30, brewed coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and reviewed the day's list before the bell rang. The boys arrived in staggered fashion, never late but never together either, as if showing up all at once felt too much like being seen. They were learning. Not the obvious things first. Not inventory codes or receipts. They learned how to hold a door open without making it a performance. How to greet customers without suspicion. How to listen without waiting to interrupt. James noticed the changes quietly. Praise he'd learned worked best when it wasn't weaponized. It was late morning when the first real problem arrived. Eli was restocking candles when his elbow caught a glass jar. It tipped, wobbled, and shattered against the floor with a sound that silenced the room. Eucalyptus and citrus flooded the air. Eli froze. Devin swore under his breath. Marcus straightened too quickly, already bracing for impact that never came. James looked at the mess, then at Eli. You okay? Eli swallowed. Yeah. Good, James said. Grab the broom. That was it. Eli stared at him. You're not mad. James shrugged. You didn't throw it. Gravity did. Marcus frowned. That stuff's expensive. So is fear, James replied. Sweep carefully. Glass bites. They cleaned it up together. No yelling. No lecture. Just work. When Clara walked in 10 minutes later, she stopped short, taking in the scene. For boys moving with purpose, James crouched beside them, explaining how to scrape wax without scratching tile. You're running a daycare now? She asked. James stood, smiling. More like a lab. For what? Behavior, he said. Turns out people respond better when you don't assume they'll fail. Clara glanced at the empty space where the candle had been. And when they do? You show them what accountability looks like, James said. Without humiliation. She studied him. You don't think you're setting them up for disappointment? I think disappointment finds everyone eventually, James replied. This way, they'll recognize it when it arrives. She huffed. You're exhausting. So I've been told. Clara lingered longer that day, pretending to browse while watching interactions unfold. A woman thanked Marcus for carrying her bag. Devon helped an elderly man read a card aloud without snickering. Luis rang up a sale and beamed like he'd won something. By closing time, Clara hadn't left. You didn't have to stay, James said, flipping the sign. I know, she replied. I wanted to. They walked out together, the boys peeling off one by one with murmured goodbyes. You're changing things, Clara said finally. Maybe, James said. Or maybe I'm just not getting in the way. She stopped walking. Why here? James considered. Because this is where I am. She looked at him, really looked, as if trying to find the flaw she was sure existed. You make it sound simple. It is, James said. Simple isn't easy. For the first time since she'd met him, Clara smiled without reservation. Careful, she said. People will start expecting things from you. James chuckled. They already do. They parted at the corner, Clara watching him walk away, the shop's lights glowing softly behind her. Inside, candle wax hardened where it had spilled. No longer a mess, just a mark of something handled instead of feared. And somewhere between broken glass and quiet competence, respect had begun to take shape. Chapter 4, The Shape of Family. James learned two important things the morning his son arrived. First, no matter how carefully you planned, children had a way of detonating schedules simply by existing. Second, Clara Hale had never seen him lose control before, and apparently found that unsettling. Ethan burst through the shop door at 10:15 sharp, backpack bouncing against his shoulders, grin wide enough to qualify as a weather event. Dad! James barely had time to brace before 12 years of momentum collided with him. He staggered back a step, laughing as he caught his son around the shoulders. Hey, buddy, he said, squeezing. Growth spurt. Ethan pulled back, proud. Mom says I'm almost as tall as you. James snorted. Your mother lies with love. From behind the counter, Clara froze mid-sentence, a clipboard tucked under her arm. She blinked once, then twice. This must be my favorite person, James said. Ethan, this is Clara. She keeps me from accidentally starting a neighborhood uprising. Ethan's eyes lit up. Cool. Clara recovered enough to extend her hand. Nice to meet you. Ethan shook it solemnly. My dad says you don't trust him. James winced. I did not say that. Clara's mouth twitched. Smart kid. They spent the morning rearranging displays Ethan insisted were sad and should be happier, which somehow translated into moving all the birthday cards to the front and grouping candles by color instead of scent. James allowed it. Ruth would have pretended to scold and then left it exactly that way. At lunch, they walked to the hospital together. Ruth was propped up in bed, knitting with more determination than skill. Her face lit up when she saw Ethan. Well, look at you, she said. Still handsome. Must run in the family. Ethan beamed. Dad says you're the boss. Ruth snorted. Your father exaggerates. They talked about school, about the shop, about nothing that mattered and everything that did. When Ethan wandered off to investigate the vending machines, Ruth's gaze sharpened. You're different with him, she said softly. James didn't look away. I should be. No, Ruth said. You are. Later, walking back, Clara slowed her pace to match James's. You're a good father. He shrugged. I show up. That's not nothing, she said. Ethan kicked a pebble ahead of them. Dad lets me help. James smiled down at him. Responsibility builds character. Mom says that too, Ethan said. You guys say the same stuff even when you're not together. Clara glanced between them, something thoughtful settling behind her eyes. That evening, after Ethan fell asleep on the couch with a book half open on his chest, Clara lingered in the doorway of the shop. You didn't tell me about him, she said. You didn't ask, James replied gently. She nodded. Fair. They stood there, the quiet stretching comfortably. Family's not always the shape you expect, Clara said. James smiled. But it's still the shape that holds you. For the first time, Clara didn't argue. And for the first time in a long while, James thought about what it might mean to stay. Chapter 5, Setbacks Don't Ask Permission. The first call came just after dusk. James was in Ruth's kitchen, helping Ethan with math homework while a pot of soup simmered on the stove. The house smelled like onions and thyme, and the faint medicinal sharpness that clung to hospital-issued blankets felt briefly like something stable. His phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at it, then frowned. That's odd. Ethan looked up. Bad odd or interesting odd? James smiled. Let's hope for interesting. He answered. James. Mr. Towns. The voice on the other end was tight, official. This is Officer Calder. There's been an incident at your aunt's shop. The world didn't stop. Tilted. What kind of incident? James asked, already standing. Vandalism. Broken window. Graffiti. James closed his eyes for a half-second. Anyone hurt? No, the officer said. But you should come down. James thanked him, hung up, and turned to Ethan. Change of plans, buddy, he said gently. Ethan's face fell. Am I in trouble? No, James said immediately. None of this is on you. Ruth appeared in the doorway, cane in hand, eyes sharp despite the fatigue. What happened? The shop, James said. I'll handle it. She studied him, then nodded. You always do. The window had been shattered clean through. Glass glittered across the sidewalk like frost. Someone had spray-painted Trader in red across the brick beside the door. James stood very still. Marcus was there, pacing, hands clenched. Devin leaned against a lamppost, jaw tight. Luis sat on the curb, head in his hands. Eli was nowhere to be seen. Clara stood with the officer, arms crossed, expression unreadable. James approached calmly. What happened? Marcus rounded on him. We didn't do this. I know, James said. Clara's head snapped toward him. You don't know that. James met her gaze. I do. The officer cleared his throat. We've had reports of retaliation. Some folks aren't thrilled about changes. Changes like kids cleaning sidewalks? James asked. The officer shrugged. Fear doesn't like competition. Clara exhaled sharply. This is exactly what I warned you about. James nodded. I know. She stared at him. Do you? The boys shifted, eyes darting between them. Marcus finally snapped. Say it. Say we screwed everything up. James shook his head. You didn't. Devin's voice cracked. Then why does this keep happening to us? James stepped closer, lowering his voice. Because progress makes noise, and not everyone likes the sound. Clara looked at the graffiti, then back at James. The community board is going to ask questions. Good, James said. I have answers. The officer wrapped up his notes and left. Silence settled. I should go, Clara said, but she didn't move. You don't have to protect me, James said quietly. She laughed without humor. I'm not. I'm deciding. Eli appeared at the end of the street, breathless. I tried to stop them, he blurted. They said we thought we were better than everyone. James listened, then nodded. Thank you for trying. Eli swallowed hard. You're not firing us? James looked at each of them. I'm not going anywhere. Clara watched that, really watched it. The absence of anger, the refusal to abandon. Later, as James boarded up the window, Clara handed him nails without comment. I was wrong, she said finally. James smiled faintly. Happens to the best of us. She met his eyes. I'm standing with you. The words settled between them, solid and deliberate. Setbacks didn't ask permission, but neither did resolve. Chapter 6, What Respect Looks Like. The plywood went up crooked the first time. James stepped back, squinting at it, then adjusted the angle with a quiet grunt. The late afternoon sun caught the raw wood and turned it almost golden, an imperfect patch over the broken glass. Temporary but solid. Marcus held the ladder steady. Devin passed nails. Luis kept a running count under his breath like it mattered. Eli hovered, anxious to be useful, until James handed him the drill. Slow, James said. Let the tool do the work. Eli nodded, tongue caught between his teeth, and eased into it. When the drill bit caught clean, his eyes lit up. I did it. James smiled. You did. Across the street, people slowed, watched, not with suspicion this time, but curiosity. A woman pushing a stroller paused. An older man tipped his hat. Someone brought out a broom and began sweeping glass without being asked. Clara noticed before James did. They're helping, she said quietly. James glanced around, taking it in. People like forward motion. By the time the board was secured, the sidewalk was clean. Mrs. Kowalski appeared with a plate balanced carefully in both hands. You boys look hungry, she said, voice brisk but kind. Chocolate chip. Still warm. No one moved. Marcus looked at James, uncertain. Permission seeking. James nodded once. Say thank you. Thank you, they chorused, awkward and sincere. Mrs. Kowalski smiled like she'd been waiting years for that exact sound. When she walked away, the boys stared at the cookies like they were evidence of something fragile and real. Eat, James said. Respect tastes better when it's fresh. They laughed, really laughed, and something loosened. Later, after the shop closed and the boys drifted home, Clara stayed behind. She leaned against the counter, arms folded, gaze thoughtful. You know they'll mess up again, she said. James wiped his hands on a rag. Of course. And you'll still be here. Yes. She studied him. Most people would call that foolish. James met her eyes. Most people confuse caution with wisdom. Silence settled, comfortable but charged. You're not trying to be their father, Clara said finally. James shook his head. No. I'm just a man showing up. Her voice softened. That's what fathers do. The words hung between them, gentle and dangerous. Outside, the plywood caught the glow of a street lamp. Not pretty, not permanent, but proof that something broken had been addressed instead of ignored. Clara straightened, slinging her bag over her shoulder. The board meeting is tomorrow night. I'll be there, James said. She hesitated, then smiled. I know. As she left, James locked up and stood for a moment, breathing in the quiet. Respect wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself. It showed up in small, steady ways. And tonight it had shown up everywhere. Chapter 7. Letting Go Without Losing. The community boardroom had the acoustics of a place designed for disagreement. Every cough echoed. Every shuffle of paper sounded like impatience. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, just loud enough to irritate anyone already inclined to be irritated. Folding chairs filled the space in crooked rows, their metal legs scraping the tile as people settled in with expressions that ranged from curious to defensive. James arrived early, as he always did. He sat in the second row, hands folded loosely in his lap, posture relaxed without being careless. Across the room, the boys entered together this time. Not clumped, not spread out, but moving with an unconscious cohesion that hadn't existed weeks ago. Marcus scanned the room, alert but steady. Devin nodded politely at an older man he recognized from delivery routes. Luis whispered something that made Eli exhale a nervous laugh. James didn't wave. He didn't need to. They knew he was there. Clara arrived last. She paused just inside the door, scanning the room with a professional eye trained to spot fault lines before they cracked. When she saw James, something in her shoulders eased. She crossed the room and took the seat beside him. You okay? She asked quietly. James smiled. I've faced faculty review panels. This is friendlier. That's depressing, she murmured. He chuckled. Accurate, though. The meeting came to order. The chairperson, a woman with steel gray hair and a voice sharpened by decades of refereeing arguments, ran through formalities before opening the floor. The concerns came quickly. Liability, safety, precedent. A man in the third row stood and spoke at length about responsibility, about how good intentions didn't undo consequences. A woman near the back questioned whether James was exploiting the boys for optics. Another voice, older, tired, asked why the neighborhood should trust a man who hadn't lived there long enough to understand it. James listened, really listened. When it was his turn, he stood without haste. I won't pretend I understand everything about this community, he began. That would be dishonest. A few eyebrows lifted. But I do understand people, he continued. And I understand choice. He didn't pace. He didn't gesture much. He spoke the way he taught, clear, measured, respectful. These young men weren't hired because they were convenient, James said. They were hired because they were here, because ignoring them hadn't worked, because punishing them preemptively hadn't worked either. Someone muttered something under their breath. James didn't rise to it. They weren't asked to be perfect, he went on. They were asked to show up, and they did, every day, on time, even when it would have been easier not to. He gestured toward the boys, not dramatically, just enough to acknowledge them. When the shop was vandalized, they didn't run, James said. They didn't retaliate. They came back the next morning and helped fix it. The room quieted. Fear is loud, James said softly. Respect is quieter, but it lasts longer. The vote wasn't swift. There were murmured side conversations, raised eyebrows, a brief recess. Clara sat rigid beside James, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. When the chairperson finally called the vote, James didn't look at the board. He looked at the boys. The motion passed, not unanimously but decisively enough. Something broke open in the room then. Applause didn't erupt, but conversations did. The tension drained in small, careful increments. Outside, the night air felt cooler than it had any right to. Clara leaned against her car, pressing her palms flat against the hood as if grounding herself. You changed the temperature in that room, she said. James shook his head. They did. She studied him for a long moment. I got an offer today. He waited, letting the silence give her space. State level, she said. Bigger reach, bigger budget, bigger headaches. James smiled. Sounds like you. Her laugh was short and unsteady. It's 2 hours away. I know, he said gently. She looked up at him then. Really looked. I don't want to win by walking away from something that matters. James thought of Ruth, stubborn and smiling through pain. Of Ethan, growing too fast and watching everything. Of the shop, imperfect but alive with intention. There's more than one way to stay, he said. And more than one way to build. She stepped closer. You're staying. Yes. Because you have to? No, James said. Because I want to. That was all it took. The kiss wasn't urgent. It wasn't theatrical. It was steady, like two people agreeing on a direction and starting to walk. Later, James sat on Ruth's porch, the night thick with cicada song. You look settled, Ruth said, knitting needles clicking. I am, James replied. She nodded once, satisfied. Good. The right kind of love doesn't ask you to shrink your life. It helps you grow into it. James leaned back, the stars unbothered by human uncertainty. Letting go, he realized, wasn't always about release. Sometimes it was about choosing where to place your hands and building forward. Chapter 8. Tomorrow is also the best day. The shop no longer smelled new. It smelled lived in. Paper and wax still lingered, but now there was coffee in the mornings, dust tracked in on work boots, citrus cleaner in the afternoons, and something harder to name layered beneath it all. Intention, maybe. Or pride. James stood behind the counter, reading a handwritten sign taped beside the register. Deliveries run by Marcus, Devin, Luis, and Eli. Ask about neighborhood orders. He smiled every time he saw it. The boys rotated shifts now. Not because James demanded it, but because they asked. Marcus kept a ledger with almost obsessive precision. Devin learned inventory faster than James ever had. Luis talked customers into buying cards they didn't know they needed. Eli, once the quietest, handled deliveries like a man entrusted with something sacred. They weren't fixed. They were functioning. That mattered more. The bell rang and Clara stepped inside, shaking rain from her jacket. Her hair was pulled back, her expression lighter than it had been weeks ago. "You're late," James said mildly. "I know," she replied. "I stopped by the state office." He raised an eyebrow. "And I declined." James studied her carefully, giving the moment the respect it deserved. "Are you sure?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "They offered flexibility, consulting, remote work. I don't have to disappear to matter." She stepped closer. "I want to build where I stand." James reached for her hand. "I'm glad." Later that afternoon, Ruth arrived in a wheelchair, her cane balanced across her lap like a badge of authority. The boys froze mid-task. "Well," Ruth said, surveying the shop, "you didn't burn it down." Marcus straightened. "We tried not to." She laughed, sharp and delighted. "Good boy." She insisted on a tour, commented on displays, corrected James on candle placement, praised the boys in a way that made them squirm and glow all at once. "This place feels alive," she said quietly to James when they were alone. "It always was," he replied. "It just needed hands." Ethan arrived that evening, taller than last time, backpack heavier with books and expectations. He greeted the boys like old friends, helped close up without being asked, and sat on the counter swinging his legs while James counted the register. "You staying?" Ethan asked casually. James met his son's eyes. "Yeah, I am." Ethan nodded, satisfied. "Good." There was no speech, no negotiation, just acceptance. That night, after the shop lights dimmed and the street settled into quiet, James locked the door and stood for a moment, hand resting on the glass. The plywood was gone, the window replaced, the brick cleaned, not erased, acknowledged. Clara slipped her arm around his. "You ready?" "For what?" "For tomorrow." James smiled, wide and easy. "Always." They walked home together, the town familiar now. Not perfect, not safe in every way, but awake. People nodded as they passed. Someone called out thanks. Someone else waved. At the house, Ruth was already asleep, knitting abandoned mid-row. Ethan snored softly from the couch, book fallen open on his chest. James covered them both with blankets. Later, lying beside Clara in the quiet dark, she traced idle circles on his arm. "You never stopped believing," she said. James considered it. "I stopped believing in inevitability, not in people." She smiled against his shoulder. "That's worse." He laughed softly. As sleep crept in, James held to the thought that had carried him through everything. The broken moments, the uncertain ones, the choices made without guarantees. Today had been the best day of his life. And when he woke tomorrow, no matter what waited for him, it would be the best day too. Because he would meet it awake, present, and willing to choose again. And that, he had learned, was everything. Epilogue. 1 year later, the first thing people noticed wasn't the shop. It was the sidewalks. They were cleaner now, not in the sterile, over-policed way that came from fear of fines or warnings, but in the lived-in way that came from pride. Chalk drawings appeared where broken glass used to glitter. Planters showed up outside buildings that had never bothered with flowers before. Someone painted over old graffiti with a mural so bright it made the block feel wider. The shop was still there, of course. It always would be, but it had stopped being the point. Marcus unlocked the door every morning at 8 sharp. He wore a collared shirt now, not because anyone forced him to, but because he liked the way it made people look at him, like he belonged behind a counter instead of being watched from across one. He handled invoices with a steadiness that would have surprised anyone who'd known him a year earlier, and when delivery drivers tried to rush him, he smiled and said, "We'll do it right the first time." Devin ran the back room like a chessboard. Inventory was logged, labeled, and anticipated. When another shop owner down the street started selling candles, Devin helped them set up a supplier instead of seeing it as competition. "More stores means more foot traffic," he explained, as if it were obvious. It was. Luis had discovered he was good with people, really good. He remembered names, anniversaries, stories. He knew who liked humor on their cards and who wanted something quiet. Customers asked for him specifically. When he laughed now, it filled the room instead of bouncing off walls defensively. Eli delivered. He walked with his shoulders back, head up, a clipboard tucked under his arm like a promise. Kids on the block watched him pass the way they once watched older boys, with something closer to awe than fear. He stopped to talk to them. asked about school, about what they liked doing. He listened. And then there were the others, because it hadn't stopped with James. A mechanic 2 blocks over hired 3 teenagers to help clean bays and organize tools. The cafe owner started a paid after-school shift. No experience required, just consistency. The florist took on an apprentice. The laundromat posted a sign. Ask about work hours. No speeches were given. No programs launched. No press releases written. The change spread the way oxygen does, quietly, invisibly, until people realized they'd been holding their breath for years. James noticed all of it, but he didn't claim it. He still opened the shop sometimes, still taught his online courses, still walked to the hospital with Ruth on slow afternoons even though she no longer needed the cane. He listened more than he talked. When people thanked him, he redirected gently. Everyone showed up, he'd say. That's all. Clara worked from a small office 2 streets over now, consulting on community development while staying rooted where she could see outcomes instead of projections. Her job title sounded impressive on paper. In practice, it meant coffee meetings, grant reviews, and a steady stream of people asking, "Can this work here too?" Her answer was almost always the same. Yes, if you're willing to let it. Ethan visited every other weekend, taller each time, his voice dropping unpredictably like it was testing new ground. He helped at the shop without being asked and listened, really listened. When the boys talked, they didn't talk down to him. They didn't puff up either. They treated him like someone who would grow into his own weight. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the street settled into its softer hours, James stood outside the shop and watched the neighborhood move. A group of kids swept a stoop. Someone laughed from an open window. A delivery truck idled while Eli checked a list. Marcus locked the door with practiced ease. Clara leaned against James's shoulder, her hand warm and familiar at his back. "Did you expect this?" she asked. James thought about it. "No," he said honestly. "But I expected something." She smiled. "That's you. You leave room for people to surprise you." Across the street, Mrs. Kowalski sat on her stoop, watching the boys pass like a proud general surveying a well-kept field. She waved at James. He waved back. The town wasn't fixed. It was better. And better, James had learned, wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with banners or victories. It arrived in confidence, in posture, in the way people met each other's eyes without flinching. Later that night, lying beside Clara, James stared at the ceiling, listening to the easy quiet of a place that no longer braced for impact. Today had been a good day. Not perfect, not remarkable, just solid, earned, shared. And when he closed his eyes, he knew with the same steady certainty he'd always carried, tomorrow would be the best day too.